to bring you updates of President Trump's visit. He's due to land in Buckingham Palace probably within the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, but we move to something that we told you about already in the show, and one of the 13, that last time I checked, who knows, there may be more, 13 Conservatives who think that they could take over the party and indeed the country is with me in the studio to take your calls and questions. Welcome to the former Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, Conservative MP for South Northamptonshire, and I know you, as I have as well, experienced some problems getting here, so I'm grateful that you showed such fortitude and diligence to make it. The calls are coming in. One from me first. Andrea Leadsom, I know you're a committed Conservative. It's fair to say that it's the Conservative Party that decided to call the referendum, that then failed to deliver on the referendum, that had another election that I would say put them deeper into a hole, and yet again failed to deliver. Why should anyone have confidence in the party again?
Well, we are committed to delivering Brexit, and you're absolutely right, we failed to do it so far. The reason for that is, of course, the parliamentary arithmetic, which is the fault of the last general election, the fact that we're in a hung parliament.
May?
Well, absolutely, it's the government's fault, I completely agree. But, of course, at the time, the feeling was that a bigger majority, which was what the Prime Minister was going for, would have actually enabled us to leave the EU. So it's fully our committed policy and government intention is to leave the EU, and we have to find a way to do it. And I do believe that I do have a way that I would leave the European Union with a very carefully thought through 3-step managed exit.
This is what you wrote about in one of the newspapers.
Yeah, that's right.
Not all my listeners will have had sight of that. I read it on the weekend, wasn't it, in the Sun?
That's right, yes.
Just take briefly through what you wrote in the Sun.
So very briefly, we have to leave at the end of October, and the withdrawal agreement bill is dead. That's not coming back to life. So what I think we should do is 3 steps. Number 1, introduce legislation in the Commons and the Lords to put in place sensible measures like on citizens' rights, on the future for Gibraltar, the future for goods in circulation at the point of exit. Introduce those bills before summer recess in the expectation that the EU will want to ratify their side of that. Those things were already agreed in the withdrawal agreement, and they would be sensible steps. Step 2 is to ramp up preparations for no deal, to ramp up preparations for the Northern Ireland border, and really importantly to consider a temporary free trade agreement with the EU that we would propose, that they would have to agree to, that would perhaps just last for a year whilst we sort out permanent arrangements. And really importantly to communicate that widely to the public, to businesses, and of course really importantly to Parliament, so that we don't have this kind of secret squirrels thing where people don't understand what's going on. And then the 3rd step is to lead a delegation, a ministerial delegation, to talk to some of the EU heads of state who themselves have been clear. You know, President Macron just yesterday saying we can't have an extension beyond the end of October. So they know that we're now facing a hard deadline, and taking it to them, suggesting here are the measures that we can put in place if the EU agrees, culminating in a summit in Belfast and Dublin in September, to which the proposed new commissioners would be invited. They won't be in place yet, but we can invite all colleagues in the EU to agree what steps we want to put in place to manage our exit at the end of October, so that it's a much smoother experience for EU citizens and for UK citizens.
I've got more questions in a moment. Andrea Leadsom, make sure you can hear Ava. The volume is right as Ava comes in from Somerset, and I think it's a question related to what you've just heard from Mrs. Leadsom. Ava, go ahead. Good morning.
Yes, I want to know, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, where do we stand with this 39 billion?
Well, clearly, if there is no agreement at all, then we're not making any payments of the 39 billion to the European Union, because there's no legislative means by which to do that. But to fully answer your question, there are certain amounts of money that we very clearly do owe the EU for sort of plans for shared transactions and commitments that we've made as a part of the EU that we would, of course, honour. And at the same time, a large part of that 39 billion was to pay for an implementation period. So the things that we wouldn't have, i.e. the implementation period we wouldn't be paying for, the commitments that we have previously made to the EU we would be paying for. So there would still be some payments to be made, but it would be significantly less than 39 billion.
What would it be down to? Do we know?
Well, I mean, it would have to be calculated. I mean, the 39 billion was always an estimate. But if you think roughly that 20 billion of the 39 was in effect to pay our net payments to the EU for the 2-year implementation period, 21-month implementation period, and then approximately 9 or 10 billion was the commitments that we had genuinely committed to, signed up to, and then there's another 10 billion of the 39 that you would be discussing whether that money was due or not. But certainly if there was no deal, then the 39 29 billion would not be being, as of necessity, paid over to the EU.
Ava, you're back on.
Yeah, that's comforting to know. Your proposals all sound very, very sensible. Where were they published?
Oh, so I did a piece for the Sun on Sunday, so you can see it online there, but also on my website, teamleadsom.com. It's very clearly set out there. But really, what my own view on this is that we have to have a workable plan, recognising that we have to leave the EU by the end of October. And looking through all of the plans that have been proposed so far, I think mine is the only workable plan. And of course, I've had the advantage of being Leader of the Commons in charge of legislation for the last 2 years, so I have been able to think quite carefully about how it could work with the timing of parliamentary sittings and so on.
Teamleadsom.com to get more details.
Yeah.
Ava, thank you for that. Would you ever walk away, though, Andrea Leadsom?
Absolutely, yes. You have to be prepared to walk away. You know, to be successful.
WTO.
Indeed, to be successful in any negotiation, you have to be prepared to walk away. But I do think that this talk of sort of crashing out with no deal is a misnomer. I mean, take, for example, citizens' rights. In the event that we didn't have an agreement, already almost all EU states have put in place their own unilateral plans for how they would look after the rights of UK citizens. The United Kingdom has put in place plans for how we would look after the rights of EU citizens. So there are preparations in all circumstances for had we left without an arrangement at the 29th of March, and right across all areas. No deal doesn't actually mean literally no deal. It just means that there is no EU-UK shared multilateral arrangements in place. And my managed exit seeks to put some of those multilateral arrangements in place.
Barry's in Norwich. Barry, your question. Go ahead.
Hello, good morning. Andrea, I'd just like to know if you were to become Prime Minister, would you call a general election?
Hi, Barry. No, I wouldn't. I think we've seen it just in the last couple of days how appalling it would be if we called a general election and enabled a Jeremy Corbyn Marxist-style government. I don't know if you've seen the press in the last couple of days, but some of their plans for taxing homeowners and in effect taking part of your asset should you fail to pay up certain taxes that the Labour are proposing. I mean, these things are really disastrous. You know, their plans to nationalise the energy industry, to renationalise the railways. I mean, anybody who's lived as long as I have and who lived through the nationalisation of those industries. I mean, I remember as a kid, if you wanted to have a telephone, a landline, you had to apply for it and wait for 6 months. I mean, how we've moved on since then. And the thought of a Labour government taking us back to that is absolutely terrifying. So no, I would never risk it.
The railways run that well, though, do they?
Well, they run considerably better than they did under the days of nationalisation. And when you consider that the number of passengers is something like doubled, if not greater than that, since the days of nationalisation, the services run far more to time. I mean, we do have a problem with overcrowding, and that does need to be addressed. And in fact, the government's spending £48 billion on rail infrastructure and improving the services for passengers. So, you know, it's not something that need to improve that is very clearly there.
But just coming back to Barry's main point, when you consider the leadership of the Conservative Party is around 125,000, 130,000, whatever, don't the people of Britain deserve a say with a general election?
Well, you know, that was clearly at the last leadership campaign in 2016, that was the thesis that was put forward then. The reality is that the country votes for a government.
Yes.
That is the style of our democracy.
The members, and it's fair to say that the membership is probably going to be slightly older, probably slightly more white than necessarily the whole of the country, yet they get to choose the PM?
Well, I think it's really important doing things like your show, Nick, so that people can actually hear what you're talking about. And very much, you know, constituents, voters around the country have huge influence on MPs. So I've been talking to lots of MPs about my own leadership campaign, and people are saying, well, I've consulted with my constituents and this is the kind of feedback I'm getting, and so my choice of leader is going to be influenced by that. So I do think that this whole national debate, you know, with the number of candidates we've got and with the good efforts of broadcasters to get candidates on air so that people can hear from them, is all really important. I do take the point that a general election might, you know, in one sense be good to give people the chance again. But what I actually think the priority has to be is leaving the European Union. We can consider what happens next once we've delivered on the last democratic mandate, where the country decided to leave the EU and we have simply failed to do so, and we've got to put that right.
Barry, thank you. Ian in Kettering. Ian, your question to Andrea Leadsom. Go ahead.
Morning, Andrea.
Good morning.
Yes, Ian, go ahead.
My question is very close to my heart. My family, we have a member of the family who's from the Netherlands, and there's great uncertainty at the moment about where his security in the UK will be. Now, he's lived here for, I believe it was just over 35 years. He was a lecturer at Sheffield University, and he's worked for the NHS as a senior manager in physio. And what I would like to know is, if you became PM, what legislation would you guarantee for equality rights for workers' rights and the rights for those EU citizens with a settled status within the UK, where they've contributed so much to us, but this is now, for 3 years, created so much turmoil for so many people with that uncertainty that your party's created?
Yeah, and I really do sympathise with your family member, Ian. And, certainly, as I said at the start of the programme, it would be a top priority for me, if I'm Prime Minister, to introduce a second reading of a citizens' rights bill, which would in effect enshrine the already agreed rights for UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK. It would do the UK element of legislation in the expectation that the European Union would also want to ratify their side of that agreement. So that, for me, sorting out the terrible situation that citizens who are caught up in this have been in would be a top priority. It cannot be right that people who have made their lives in the EU, or indeed EU citizens who've made their lives in the UK, are still living under this weight of uncertainty. So I would want to lift that as soon as possible. And then to your other point about workers' rights and so on, the UK government, and particularly the Conservative government, have done so much more than the EU to protect the rights of workers. We've gone far further in areas like shared parental leave, in protecting the rights of workers. We're looking at legislation now to ensure that workers are protected, for example, when they take maternity or paternity leave. And all of those things are very clearly a part of a Conservative agenda to actually make people's lives better, to give them more job security. And of course, what we've seen is 3.5 million more people in work since 2010, the highest real wage increases since 2010, and things are improving. There's a long way to go, but I would dearly love the chance to put in place some of the policies that will really make lives better for people in the United Kingdom.
Ian, thank you. Vikas in Hounslow. Go ahead, Vikas.
Hi, good morning, Andrea.
Hi, morning.
I want to ask you what your plans, should you become Prime Minister, what would your plans be to tackle the epidemic that is occurring regarding knife crime? Just to put this into context for you, 18 months ago, I lost my best friend. He was brutally murdered, stabbed to death, just at the top of my mother's road. And I am in a position where post that event, I have paid close attention to the statistics that we've seen, and it's clear, I don't think there's any debate, that knife crime is on the rise. And I want to know, if you become Prime Minister, what are you going to be doing to tackle this? Because we're losing a generation of people here.
Yeah.
And indeed, unfortunately, today marks the 33rd fatal stabbing in London. Someone who was stabbed on the weekend, sadly passing away in the early hours this morning. Stay on the line, Vikas. I'm sorry for your personal loss. Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you. Yes, Vikas, I'm really, really sad to hear that. I'm so sorry. I mean, it is absolutely appalling, the rise in serious crime, and particularly in knife crime. And actually, the government is doing a huge range of different things to try and tackle this, ranging from a serious violence task force, which brings together all of the police, education services, local authorities, to try and find a way to look at serious knife crime from a public health perspective. So to try and tackle not just the incidents themselves, which is a policing matter, but actually what's motivating people to join gangs, to actually carry a knife, and so on. So, I have a particular passion for promoting far greater early intervention to provide support in the earliest years for new families. And I think very often what we see is babies who struggle to form a secure bond with their parents can very often go on to have mental health problems, can very often be attracted to gangs because they don't have that secure attachment. So that's at the very earliest stage. But later on, when children get into school and it becomes apparent that perhaps they're not attending school, that perhaps they're hanging out with the wrong crowd, or that in fact they feel afraid for their own safety, so they start carrying a knife for that reason. That kind of early intervention is important. We've just introduced in our offensive weapons bill some knife crime prevention orders, which will enable the police to actually put wraparound prevention measures around particular individuals that they think are at risk either of harm to themselves or harm to others through knife crime. So there are lots of measures in place, including funding for many different community initiatives. So a really good initiative, that a charity that goes into hospitals where there have been knife crime incidents and talks to those particular young people who've been victims of knife crime, who have survived, to try and talk them into changing their lives and so on. But what I would specifically do as Prime Minister is I would put in place a senior, focused, perhaps retired police officer who has seen it all, to actually focus on coordinating all of our efforts to reduce serious crime and knife crime. I think it's only if you've got that particular focus on that with a budget to match it that you will actually start to see those numbers reduce.
One for the whole country, do you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
one
someone
for the
like
whole
a
country.
Lord Stevens or someone like
that sort of thing. Yes, exactly. So it would need to be somebody very experienced with a lot of operational experience. I already have candidates in mind who I've met over the years, and they certainly do exist.
Whom do we speak?
Well, I couldn't.
All right, well, give me their level. They're former chief constables.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of
just so
level.
I get an
People
idea.
who've really been through the whole policing
But they'll have squads
experience.
working to them?
They would have not necessarily policing squads, but what they would be doing is coordinating the strategy. Because what I've found as Leader of the Commons, every week I do business questions, and every week the question of knife crime and how we're tackling it comes up. And it seems to me that we're doing a lot. There's a lot that we can do, but it really needs focused coordination.
And where are you on Stop and Search? Before I bring Vikas back, where are you on Stop and Search? You're a supporter?
Oh, I absolutely am.
So Theresa May got that wrong,
Well,
didn't she?
it's not actually what Theresa May was seeking to do was to make sure that Stop and Search was fairly balanced and that it didn't unfairly penalise those who are perfectly
She's
innocent.
cut too many police officers, hasn't she?
Well, that I think certainly policing budgets would be a priority for the comprehensive
Which
spending
in English
review.
means you agree.
I think we do need more police on the beat, but
So
we also
too many were cut.
Yeah, well, it's what was happening at the time. Let's be absolutely clear about this. Is we were left with an economy in absolute ruins, and so all departments had to deal with doing more with less. But the state of policing is changing. Well, the state of policing is changing, and actually, what we need to do.
£56 billion for a railway, nobody
much
wants.
more. Well, there's some other policy ideas that we can talk about, but the state of policing does need to change.
Strange
what we need
priorities.
to do is to look at cybercrime. We need to look at how domestic violence is being tackled, how the police can get more involved in prevention, and so on. So I do think policing is changing, but they do need more money.
Vikas, a quick response from you, because you suffered from it personally. Briefly, sir, how would you, because it's touched you personally, how would you handle this issue?
So I think the real issue, I understand your conversation and your thoughts regarding early prevention. I think definitely, Nick, your point about policing is very relevant here. I think, statistically, they're down by 20,000 out of 140,000 in the last 7 or 8 years.
Well, Mrs. Leadsom has conceded possibly too many did go. She has accepted.
Well, certainly the police cuts and the budget cuts that they've had to take have had an impact on, in my mind, certainly it's undeniable, an impact on knife crime. But I do think your real focus needs to be on deterrence and actually making it such that individuals who are today quite comfortable with carrying a knife, feeling as though there is no direct consequence to them carrying a knife, I think those deterrents are, they need to be enhanced significantly. Prevention is important, but just making sure that individuals, if they have a second thought that they're going to be carrying a knife for whatever reason, they walk away from that idea. They realise that if I get caught with a knife, I potentially am going to be going to jail. I think that is really important.
Yeah, completely agree.
That,
and I hope, and I sincerely hope everybody listening to this is noting your words, Vikas. I think you are absolutely right. The reason knife crime becomes a problem is because too many people are carrying knives, and whether it's to protect themselves or to be aggressive, if they stopped doing it, then actually we would decrease the pressure and the appalling tragedies that are happening far too often.
Commiserations to you again, Vikas.
Yes.
Alistair in Tottenham. You're through to Andrea Leadsom. Go ahead, Alistair. Good morning.
Yeah, so far less consequential than knife crime
Go on.
difficulties at the moment. But very quickly, HS2, Mrs. Leadsom, would you be in or out of HS2?
So I have been very concerned about the project right from 2009 when it was first talked about. My view is that a high-speed train going so fast, 250 miles an hour, in a country the size and the geographical range of the United Kingdom is extraordinarily difficult to engineer. And as sort of 9 years on, 10 years on now, the engineers are coming up with problems, and there are question marks over how deliverable it is. So
the
I
train
think
can't
a lot
actually
of
travel
money.
at 250 miles an hour, is that right?
Well, I would have concerns about it, to be perfectly honest. You know, this is not a sort of great open plains type of country. This is a beautiful sort of green and pleasant land, and the
as soon as you
engineering
had a
challenges
Euston, you're
are
applying the
serious.
brakes for Birmingham, effectively, aren't
Exactly,
you?
that's it. So, you know, I mean, we do have, in a sense, high-speed trains. We've got the intercity trains, which are themselves high-speed by most people's standards. So I certainly think we need more train capacity, and certainly I think the north of England needs a significant increase and enhancement in its own infrastructure. But I would have a very urgent review of HS2 in terms of value for money
What's
and
an urgent
doability.
Mrs. May loved reviews and consultations. We're not going to get more of those, are we?
No, it's the issue is, I mean, I could very, very, very well sit here and say, well, let's just get rid of it. But
Right,
the reality
why don't you say
is,
that?
because a huge amount of money has been spent on it, there's already been a significant amount of work done to deliver it. And what you do have to do with the view to value for taxpayers' money is not simply write off billions of pounds if you feel we've reached a tipping point where it's important to go ahead.
How deep into the 56 are we?
Well, that's the question. That's what we need to understand. It could
somebody
be
must know.
around. It could be as much as £12 billion.
already?
It could be, and that's why I would want to do an urgent review. I mean, that figure isn't out
but
there.
you're minded
that's,
towards scrapping it, aren't you?
Well, I certainly think I have big concerns about the project, but this isn't about.
Well, I'm going to put that as minded towards scrapping it.
Okay, you can do
Well,
that.
you're not denying it.
Yeah, no, I'm not denying it because
Right.
I have grave concerns about the viability of the project, but I would spend the money on improving transport infrastructure if that urgent review found that this particular project is not going to deliver good value for money.
Alistair, thank you for that question. Malcolm in Bodmin, your question to Andrea Leadsom. Malcolm, go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Morning, Andrea.
Morning.
Andrea, on health and social care, the government have promised the 10 billion over the next 5 years, whatever the period is. But on social care, with us Brexiting, with us several of the candidates looking to reduce income tax, corporation tax, various other taxes, with increasing social.
Your line has
Where
gone.
does-
Sorry, your line is in and out. Just make the question. Will increasing social care, and then your line went, sir. Just finish the question.
Sorry, Nick. Where will the money come with the reductions in tax because of Brexit to pay for health and social care? And then there's schools. There's the rest of what happens in hospitals and so on.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Your lines. So I'm going to say farewell. Stay and listen for the answer, but we might not get you back on air. Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, with the parliamentary arithmetic, we're in a hung parliament, and so I've seen over the last 2 years how difficult it is to even get statutory instruments through Parliament, secondary legislation, that propose anything like a reduction in any form of tax or indeed an increase in any sort of charge. So I think with a hung parliament, any person who's saying, well, we're going to significantly drop taxes or whatever would not get that through Parliament. So I think that's got to be realistic there. So if we want to have a lower tax economy, we need to be looking at getting a parliamentary majority at the next election to do that. In terms of health and social care, in fact, what the government has pledged is the biggest investment ever in our NHS, and that actually will amount to some £360 million a week by 2022-23, which is a significant investment, the biggest ever, and that enables the NHS to put in place its 10-year plan that will significantly improve primary care, so our ability to access GPs and so on. It is putting in place the biggest
And where does
training
that figure
programme
come
for
from again?
GPs.
Where did you say that the 360 comes from?
Well, it is in the region of 23 billion by 2022-23, and in real terms that does amount to around 360 million pounds a week.
This is the famous figure on the side of a bus.
It happens to be rather similar. similar to that. But this government has committed to a massive increase in the NHS budget, and quite right that we do that. The NHS is our most loved institution. It's been rated twice in global terms as the best healthcare system in the world. But specifically to your point about social care, this is something we have to resolve. Social care doesn't, at the moment, come out of the NHS budget. It comes out of local authority budgets, and it's contributing to the awful squeeze on local authorities. So what I would want to do is to set up a permanent, long-lasting solution for the social care problem. And what I would want to see is a cross-party commission to work on that, to report on it by 2021, because social care is something that's all about the ageing demographic of our country. People are living longer, which is fantastic, but they do need more support to live longer. And we have to therefore address the issue of how that's going to be paid for and what sort of quality of care we want. And that needs to be done cross-party so that it doesn't become a political football.
Last couple of minutes together. Let me just ask you this, and I asked Rory Stewart the same question yesterday. How many MPs have you got backing you? How many on your side at the moment?
Well, I have lots of colleagues who are liking my ideas, who like my plans to leave the EU, who think that those are credible. So what matters is how many MPs are backing me on the day. You know, the campaigns have only just started off, and I recognise that colleagues are very carefully listening to the hustings. They've not started yet. In fact, I have my first hustings this evening. So I'm very confident that I have lots of support, very good colleagues who are interested in what I have to say.
But what sort of number? Do you have a number?
Well, I don't want to give a running commentary on numbers because, you know, it's actually quite a moving feast. You know, people are switching allegiances. They're hearing things from one candidate or another candidate that they like or don't like. And so I think that it's very fluid at the moment. There are a lot of candidates out there. So I don't intend to give a running commentary.
What will get you over the line this time, though?
In what sense? In terms of...
You would actually get down to the ballot. What do you think would power you? What will be the idea that might get you forward?
Well, I certainly think all colleagues recognise we have to leave the European Union. This is an existential threat for our politics. You know, we have to deliver on the referendum. Well, no, I think all colleagues do agree. I mean, with possibly the exception of Dominic, but... virtually all Conservative colleagues, and certainly the DUP and many on the Labour benches, agree that we have to deliver on that referendum. And so what we have to talk about is a way to do that with the least disruption, but by the 31st of October.
What about this demo going on up in Birmingham with the parents who are unhappy with their children? What would you say to those parents whose children are in those classes for LGBT matters?
Well, in my view, all children have to grow up understanding the wonderful, diverse and equal society that we live in. So in terms of all kinds of relationships, children need to be taught in an open and caring way by well-briefed teachers to be able to explain about relationships. I think that the school is right. I think where I would draw a distinction, so absolutely our society must be promoted as it is with its own values of equality and opportunity. But at the same time, the views of parents must always be taken into account. And the government's policy is that schools should consult with parents. And certainly when it comes to education about sexual relationships, certainly I've known for many years of sexual relationships of all kinds, parents do have particularly strong views about what age is appropriate for their children to be taught about sexual relationships. And I think that that's right, that parents should have a say in that.
I just had a look at the bookies odds, the betting odds for the next leader of the Conservative Party. You're a similar sort of number as the horse that won the Derby. What makes you a better bet than Boris Johnson?
Well, I was a passionate Brexiteer, but really importantly, I truly believe in the bright future that awaits us when we leave the EU. No, I think he does, but my particular interest is in changing our politics so that we, as the Conservative Party, appeal to a much broader range of people. For example, I would see a top priority is tackling and addressing and leading the world in the climate emergency. So leaning into the amazing track record that we have in the United Kingdom, but at the same time helping other developing countries around the world to decarbonise, actually changing the world in that regard. But also at home, social policies that will genuinely enable people to meet their own aspirations and become the best that they can be. A really big offer to young people, to new families, and helping people to aspire to own their own business and to get on in life.
And lastly, and please excuse me if you've already been asked this, but what's the naughtiest thing you've ever done?
Well, I've thought long and hard about this, and I'd have to urge all of your listeners not to tell my mum, but it's probably when I was 16, I was going to Cornwall on holiday with a group of friends on a bus from Kent to Cornwall, and in fact I went on the back of a Honda 404 motorbike, and at the time I was so sure I was going to get caught, and I feel that's a kind of safe, naughty thing to talk about now that I'm 56.
Who was driving the motorbike?
I just can't give that away.
It was a chap, wasn't it?
Obviously,
it was a chap.
Okay.
It was all for love. Andrea Leadsom, great having you. Thank
Thanks,
you very much
Nick.
for taking the questions. Andrea Leadsom there. Remember, it's Team Leadsom if you want more details. Okay, you're listening to LBC Where News is next.
Donald Trump is due to take part in a meeting with American and British business leaders at St James's Palace aimed at increasing trade links on day 2 of his